So welcome back to Monitoring Clinical Trials. This week we're going to be talking about source data verification. My name is Steve Pope, so let's get started with our purpose. Once again, we go back to the guidelines. So the investigator/institution should maintain adequate and accurate source documents and trial records that include all pertinent observations on each of the site's trial subjects. Source data should be attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, accurate, and complete. So changes to source data should be traceable, should not obscure the original entry, and should be explained if necessary, for example, via an audit trail. For our learning objectives for this week, we're going to describe and discuss the informed consent process. We're going to discuss source data verification, or SDV, requirements. We will compare and contrast source data verification and source data review. And then finally, we're going to cite the regulatory requirements for source data verification. What's required to happen? What do we need to do on our end? What does the investigator or the site need to provide on their end? So we'll talk about those things as we go along. So let's begin with the informed consent process. So we've talked about this a lot, and you're very familiar with this from some of your other coursework and some of the other work that you've done in the clinical trials arena. But if we're going to describe and discuss the informed consent process, we need to be looking at obtaining and documenting informed consent. The investigator should comply with the applicable regulatory requirements and should adhere to GCP, good clinical practice, and to the ethical principles that have their origin in the Declaration of Helsinki. So prior to the beginning of the trial, the investigator should have the IRB or IEC's written approval or favorable opinion of the written informed consent form and any other written information to be provided to subjects. So this comes from ICH E6, section 4.8.1. So the important thing here is to understand what that process is, that it's not simply a subject's signature on the informed consent form, but that there's been a specific process followed and documented by the investigator and by the site staff that adequately explains that that subject was properly consented to be in the trial, and that consent process occurred before any trial-related activities were performed. So in this process, this informed consent process, we have to use a written consent form. So everything has to be documented in writing. It can't be, well, we told the subject this and they said they understood. None of that. It's got to be a written consent form. And that written consent form must be approved by the Institutional Review Board, by the IRB. If it's not approved, we can't use it. So, and that approval should appear on the consent form, so it should be very clear that we're using an approved informed consent form. The ICF should not contain any technical language, so not a whole lot of the medical jargon or any technical information related to the trial itself. It needs to be in easy to understand language that any reasonable person would understand what is going to happen in this trial. That form needs to be provided to the individual, and it needs to be either read to them, or they need to be given time to review that and time to ask questions. Sometimes in certain trials, the informed consent form may be sent to the subject before they show up. or they may take it with them, so they can review it with a family member if that is a requirement. And sometimes it's necessary to do that. But the important thing here is that the site has to allow time for the individual to understand what they're agreeing to, and to ask any questions that they may have, and for the PI or the person consenting the subject to answer those questions. The informed consent form needs to be signed and dated by the subject or representative and by the person conducting the consent process. So this is very important because the person that consents the subject could be the principal investigator, but it may not be the principal investigator. It needs to be someone who has been delegated that authority on the delegation log. So it's very important that we check the delegation log when we're reviewing informed consents to make sure that person that consented the subject has been properly trained and authorized to do that. And then finally, the informed consent should contain all of the requirements listed in ALCOA-CE 6, section 4.8.1. Now, in your monitoring, when you get out on the site, these informed consent documents have already been reviewed by the sponsor. They've been reviewed by the IRB. So you're not going to run into too many issues where something that is missing from those requirements is going to be in an informed consent document that was used to consent the subject. But it is important that we be familiar with what those requirements are. So we're going to document the consent process and the subject source documents. So what this means is when you're out there reviewing the consent form, you want to see in the subject source documents that the site documented that they went through the informed consent process. So you want to see a progress note or something that indicates that process was gone through with the subject, that you don't just have the subject's signature on the informed consent document. Also, the site is going to provide a copy of the signed ICF to the subject. So we want to see that that's documented in there as well. And then finally, we're going to request consent from a subject's legally acceptable representative in emergency situations. Now, for many of you, once you start monitoring, you're probably not going to see that circumstance very often. But we do want to be aware that that is available, and there are certain situations where it might be necessary to obtain consent from the subject's legally acceptable representative if we were faced with some type of an emergency. But in most cases, you're more than likely not going to see that. So when we're monitoring, it's important that we verify that the subject was properly consented before we're able to review any source documents. So that will monitoring the informed consent is going to be the first thing that you do when you're evaluating, when you're reviewing a subject's data when you're out on site. So let's talk about source data verification and some of the requirements that are associated with that. So sites are going to create source documents, which are going to be, paper documents in most cases, and they're going to be created by sites to match the protocol requirements for each visit. So they're going to be segmented normally by the visit numbers as the subjects come in. So you may have some demographic data that they're going to collect, maybe at the screening visit, and then at the randomization visit, there'll be a source page that they'll use to collect the data that's going to be collected during that randomization visit. The important thing to understand is that these source documents are the very first place that data is captured or written down. So it's important that the coordinators who conduct these visits, because they're the ones who typically do it, it's not going to be the principal investigator. It's going to be the study coordinators who in many cases are probably going to be an RN, but they may not be an RN. They may have other training, but they're going to be the ones conducting the visits. So they should have those documents present as they're going through the various assessments with each subject, and they're recording that data that they're then going to enter into our clinical database. Now, some sites are going to use an electronic medical record. These will normally be your larger hospital, larger research sites. Many of your smaller sort of independent sites, many of them are not going to have electronic medical records usually, but they may have some electronic medical record tool. You may have sites that use a combination of both. So they may have an electronic medical record that they print out from their EMR. When they do that, you have to verify that it's properly certified, that the page count is accurate, and that the person that made that copy is authorized to do so. So that's a whole nother element of source data verification. But the important thing to understand here is that these source documents are going to be created by the sites. They should match, or they're going to match, the different assessments that are done at each subject visit, and they become the first place where this data is recorded for that subject. So in addition to the source documentation that the site is going to prepare for each individual trial, you also have other data that you're going to review as part of your SDV requirements. This data will include things like patient medical records, lab reports. You may have ECGs that you have to review. You may have trial-related instruments such as diaries or questionnaires. These can be in a written form where a subject just handwrites information on their diary or on their questionnaire. It might be in electronic form. Many trials now are using what's known as electronic patient-reported outcomes. So they may have little handheld devices that look like smartphones that are issued to patients where they record their dosing data, for example, or they may record any change in their medical status, which could potentially be an adverse event once it's evaluated by the PI. They might record any new meds that they're on. And that could be a prescribed medication, or it could be an over-the-counter medication. But anything that changes from one visit to the next would be recorded on those diaries. So those are going to be available to you when you're reviewing that subject. So it's important to spend time on that, because in many cases, these diaries contain adverse events. They contain changes to concomitant medications, so you can't just ignore these things or just sort of look at them in a superficial manner. You need to spend time on those and make sure you thoroughly review them. Same thing with medical records. Many times these patients, these subjects, in between visits, they may go visit their doctor. They may go to the emergency department because they got stung by a bee, or they had a scrape, or maybe they were in some kind of accident. And so when they tell you that, the site has to make sure that they make an attempt to retrieve those medical records. Because once again, there's going to be con meds in there. There's going to be adverse events in there. You have to verify that what's in that medical document, is indeed what the patient told you. Because many times they may tell you things, and then you get the medical records, and you discover that the what was done in the hospital is a lot different from what they told you, because they won't remember all of those things. So all of these documents and pieces of information become part of the source data that you have to review during each of your monitoring visits. So a word that you're going to hear a lot when you're doing source data verification is something called ALCOA, and there's a kind of a new version of that called ALCOA-CE. And what that means is that each one of these letters stands for a specific word. So when you're reviewing the source documentation, it needs to be attributable, which means you need to know who recorded the data. They should be either signing it or putting their initials on the document to indicate who recorded the data. It needs to be legible. A lot of times these documents are handwritten because the coordinator's got it right there with them. So if they're doing blood pressure readings, for example, they're writing down 120/80 or whatever the reading is. So they need to be legible so that someone can read it. Contemporaneous. That means it has to occur during the time of the visit. It should be recorded, at that moment, not a day or two later. So it's important that when site staff are signing off on things and dating things, review those dates. Make sure they're doing it. They should be doing that on the same day of the visit. It needs to be original. So you don't want to have a situation where they're making a lot of markups and things like that. You want to get the original data in there. They may make a mistake and write down a number or a date incorrectly, and they can line through that and correct that mistake, and that's perfectly fine. It needs to be accurate. So it's got to be, the data they recorded on their page needs to be accurate with what they've entered into the database, or what may appear in another section of the source documents. For example, if they record date of birth and then on one date, but then you're reviewing the medical record and the date of birth is different in the medical record, that should trigger a query from you for them to verify, what the correct date of birth is and make any corrections to that. And then it should be complete. This is something that a lot of new monitors sometimes miss. When you're going out to a site and they've got, a listing of their source document that contains all the things that they're going to do with that visit. If there's a line in there or a question in there where they circle yes or no, or they are supposed to enter something, every item should have something entered on it. If they're missing any blanks or any check marks or checklists, things like that, point that out to them, flag that in the source document, and get them to clarify and get them to make an update to that source document. When they do that, they need to indicate that it's a late entry and that it was done on that day. So any dates where somebody is signing or initialing something needs to be on the current day. They can't go back and say, well, I actually did this on August 1st when it's really August 15th. That doesn't work. It needs to be on the same day. So let's compare and contrast source data verification and source data review. You're going to hear a lot about these two terms. So source data verification, or SDV, involves verifying that each data point collected on the ECRF is backed up by the same data point being collected on a source document. So for example, let's say at visit 1, vital signs are collected. To these should be written down on the source at visit 1 and then entered into the ECRF. So if you've got any kind of conflict between what's been recorded on a source document and what's been entered into a EDC system, then you should enter a query into the EDC system and indicate in your query that the source data indicates this data. However, a different piece of data has been entered into the EDC system. That way, when you're reviewing that query a few days later, when you're no longer at the site, you've already seen the source and you've indicated in your query text what is contained in that source. And then hopefully the source is correct and they can update the EDC system because probably there was a data entry error. In many cases, at a lot of these sites, the person that enters the data into the EDC system, may or may not be the same person that collected it at the visit. So whenever you see that, many times you're going to find a few more data entry errors when it's not the same person that enters it into the EDC system as the person that collected it originally at the site. So this is what we mean by source data verification. Does the source match what's in the EDC system? And if there is a mismatch or a conflict, then we need to query the site for that and get them to make a correction. So let's take a look at our second term here that we want to define, and that's going to be source data review. So source data review involves reviewing the entire source materials, including medical or hospital records, if they're available, lab reports, ECGs, medical progress notes that are written by doctors that may appear in the hospital or medical records, drug logs, medication lists, things like this. So there's going to be other source documents, source data that we want to review while we're out there. So these sources may not include data that's entered into the ECRF. However, they can contain important data that may have been overlooked. For example, in many cases, if you, when you're reviewing, when you're doing SDV, you may see, maybe reviewing a visit where a lab report or a lab has been drawn. In many cases, the only thing that's entered in the EDC system is whether or not they drew the lab, yes or no. You still have to take a look at the lab report to, number one, make sure that the draw actually went to the lab and you got a result back, the site got a result back for that lab. So that could create a conflict if they did not get it back. And then you have to review the lab itself to see, if there might be any out of range values there, because that could potentially be an adverse event. So you want to see that the PI or a medically trained sub-I is reviewing that lab. They're indicating whether or not any out of range values are clinically significant or not clinically significant. You'll have the same thing with ECGs. ECGs are going to come back and they're going to contain all kinds of data. Now, you may or may not understand all the little squiggly lines there that show up on that graphic, but you should be able to indicate that the PI has reviewed that, they've considered it normal or they've considered it abnormal, however not clinically significant, which in many cases that's a very common issue with many of these ECGs. A lot of cardiologists will tell you every ECG is abnormal. So that's not unusual to see that written on an ECG. So these are some of the things that you want to be reviewing as you're going out there and doing your source data verification. So what are the regulatory requirements for source data verification? Well, let's take a look at a few of them here. So section 5.1.2 states that the sponsor is responsible for securing agreement from all involved parties to ensure direct access to all trial-related sites, source data and documents, and reports for the purpose of monitoring and auditing by the sponsor and inspection by domestic and foreign regulatory authorities. What you will normally see when you go out to the site is there will be some type of source data agreement where the site indicates in writing that certain data is going to be stored in certain specific locations. It might be in a subject chart, or it could be in their medical record, and then that chart might be stored in, say, the coordinator's office, for example. So we know where it's supposed to be, and we know what's supposed to be in there. One of the things that investigators agree to is they agree to be monitored. So they agree that all of this data that they're collecting, that someone's going to be allowed to come in there and review it and take a look at it and monitor that as we go along. Then section 5.1.3 says that quality controls should be applied to each stage of the data handling to ensure that all data are reliable and have been processed correctly. And then finally, we've got additional guidelines that are found in the document Guidance for Industry Oversight of Clinical Investigations, a risk-based approach to monitoring. So what this means is that sites are required to make available their source data when asked. So if you ever get out to a site and they want to hedge a little bit on that, this is a requirement that they are supposed to follow, and it is part of their agreement with the FDA when the PI signs that 1572 that this is what they're going to do. You have some reading assignments for this week from our textbook. I'd like you to read Chapter 9, which is discussing informed consent and sort of amplifying some of the things that I've gone over in this lecture. I also want you to read the article Risk-Based Source Data Verification Approaches, Pros and Cons. I think you'll get a pretty good view of kind of what's in store for you out there when you get out monitoring your sites. And then finally, I want you to review and read Oversight of Clinical Investigations, a risk-based approach to monitoring. So I think that you'll find these readings to be very specific to what we're talking about this week. They'll amplify some of the concepts that I've discussed in this lecture, and I think it'll be good preparation for you when you get out there and you start monitoring at your sites. So in your assignment for this week, you're going to review the source documents containing source data for a subject that's in our trial, subject 1-01. So there will be source data worksheets for the screening visit 1 and also for the randomization visit. And there'll also be included concomitant medication log and also an adverse event log. You'll also have a laboratory report and an ECG report for this subject. So you'll find these documents on Moodle. I recommend that you download them to your computer. You may want to print them out, but you can probably work with them from your computer without printing them out. There'll also be a signed informed consent document there. You'll want to review that first. But I'll have some instructions in there for what you should do. So as you're reviewing these documents, I want you to follow this simple checklist as a guide. So I want you to answer, has informed consent been obtained? Were there any issues related to that you noted when you're reviewing the source data documents? Do assessments completed match the schedule of events? I'll have the schedule of events out there for you as well. Are there conflicts with the visit dates or the dates of assessments, things such as labs or ECGs? Were they done on the same day as the visit? These are things that you'll want to check. Have all concomitant medications and adverse events have been recorded and updated between visits? So these are things you want to pay attention to. Are there discrepancies between the medical history that's been documented, the physical exam that's been done, adverse event, concomitant medication pages, and logs. You'll find a lot of discrepancies among these pages. So that's something to be very careful when you're reviewing. Does the source documentation meet ALCOA-CE requirements? We went through that in this lecture, so make sure that all the source documentation that you're reviewing meets those requirements. Are there conflicts between source data signatures and the delegation log? So we need to have a copy of the delegation log handy as we review these source documents. Make sure that signatures match, that people that are properly staffed, that are properly delegated to perform certain functions have indeed performed them. Have all source data questions been answered? We don't have any blanks. We don't have any checklists that are not marked, things like that. Are there any missing answers? Is the header information correct? We don't have any headers that have the wrong subject number or something like that on it. So use these questions to verify things as you're going through the source data this week. And then I want you to post your assessment on this week's discussion forum. So let me know if you have questions. I think it'll be a fun exercise for you to work on in somewhat real world, be similar to what you're going to face when you get out there. So let me know if you have questions, and I'll see you on the discussion forum.